Hello and welcome to today's video on king and pawn endgames with the rule of the square. And this occupies a point where we either, of course, need to decide whether we bring our king in to the key squares. Here would be f4, g4 or h4. Do check out my other video on that, I'll post it at the end of this video. Or if the pawn can simply run forwards to become a queen on its own without any fear of this king coming over and winning it. And that is where the rule of the square comes in. Let's play it to g4. Of course, this jumps forwards 2 squares. And now the rule of the square essentially can tell us automatically whether or not this king is close enough. And as you would expect with the king pretty much as far away as possible, it is simply not capable of stopping this pawn. And we can tell that automatically by counting down diagonally like so, and then drawing up to in line with the pawn. And then of course the other point of the square is the queenie square, and we connect up these 4 points in blue, and we have made our so-called square. And this of course shows us that this king is too far. Even if it now moves to b7, it is still outside of this square, and you guessed it, the pawn moves forward, making this square even smaller. And now the king can come closer, the pawn will move, the square is so much shorter now, and ultimately this is why with the square super small at this point, the pawn will become a queen, and from there we can win the game. So one more time. Right now, of course, the square is like so diagonally up to in line with the pawn, and so like this. However, because the pawn on the starting square moves forwards like so, we now have our square simply too small for that black king to reach, and now the rest is history, with this king being too far away to stop the pawn becoming a queen. Well, to prove this concept, let's look at a slightly different position with this pawn from g2 migrating to the f-file. Now, well, let's play it to f4. We see this square, very technicolored, which shows that it's that much closer to the black king. Now, black can step inside of the square, which we see here. Therefore, they are able to run over and capture the pawn. For example, when f5 happens, the square is briefly here, but the king steps inside. Once again, f6 makes the square like so. The king steps inside, always making it inside with black's move. And then f7, well, the square is now very small, but of course king e7. And after being inside the square, the pawn queens, the king will simply win the pawn. One more time, that is of course if f4, black can step inside of the square, and every single move that the pawn makes, the black king can match and make it inside of each square, and then reach the queenie square in time. If we return to the start, of course, this is a moment where if white uses the fact that the key squares exist, well, the further back a pawn, at least generally in king and pawn endgames, the easier it is for us to reach the aforementioned key squares, and the harder it is for black to stop us. For example, here both kings are miles away from the f-pawn, and after simply king to b2, we will be reaching one of the 3 key squares by force. And after, for example, king to b7, king to c3, king to c6, we can go to d4 and reach, and that would win just as quickly, if not quicker. But king c4 wins the so-called opposition staring contest, forcing black to move. And why not? Because now after king to d6, king d4, once again winning the staring contest, we reach one of the key squares, and the most important key square in front of the pawn means that when black moves now, we don't continue matching, which would ultimately just twofold or indeed threefold if you continue doing it. We outflank to g5, and from here, after black is forced backwards, we can simply match once more, play our pawn up 1 square just to lose a move, and now, once the king moves, we step to the side and we're very close to reaching the key squares, laying out the red carpet once the pawn reaches the 5th rank. Being on the 6th rank, of course, we are now winning here with white, and the rest is simple. Do check out my video that explains that in full. Let's put that to the test. The rule of the square. It's black to play. Black plays king g6. The simple question is, are they inside of the square? Feel free to pause the video, have a look, and see what you think. And indeed, if you've paused the video, had a look, and found the correct answer, well done. They are indeed inside of the square. Of course, we draw diagonally down, and the moment they're in line like this, we know that they are inside of the square. And because they're coming in first, well, let's have a look first of all. b4 makes the square like so, and of course, black simply steps back inside, staying in line roughly over here, because of course it will always become a bit smaller, so coming in laterally like so makes a lot of sense. If they were to, for example, come up, well, this would be the edge of the square after the pawn comes to here, so they would have to come all the way back. So as a general rule, it does matter about the nature of the square. It is not a rectangle. You cannot simply come up over here, of course. The pawn is heading that way. For that reason, after b5, black will simply step inside of the square, at all times making it back inside like so. And it is a draw with best play. And it's worth noting, of course, as we looked at also, if white tries to make their way to the 3 key squares like so, realizing that from the rule of the square, black is of course well in time to stop the pawn on its own, then black, because their king is moving first, will simply bar the way through. And although white is the one forcing black to move, this is why you need to be in front of the pawns. You cannot come to b3 and win the opposition again. White is forever going to be behind the pawns, even if they lose a move and force black to move backwards. This is the point. Black will always be able to win the opposition, whether it be from a5 as we see here, or c5, marking the 3 squares in red to the requisite square on c3. Black will always be barring the way, and it will be a draw also in such a position. And that's how we can use the rule of the square and the knowledge of the 3 key squares for each pawn in an endgame to know whether or not we could perhaps trade into an endgame, whether or not we should push a pawn, whether or not we should get our king in, and so on and so forth. So a very useful thing in your endgame toolkit. Hope you enjoyed that. Stay tuned for more. Cheers.